All right, so today we're going to be looking at World War II from the home front and what was going on with the United States and their initial lack of involvement, and then moving into the war, and then also how it impacted people that actually remained at home and life there, because it definitely was very different from even World War One experience of how Americans experienced the war, that didn't go off to fight, and compared from World War One compared to World War Two. What was the same, however, was the initial dislike of wanting to get involved in war. And so once again, the U.S. Worked towards a position of isolationism, with the idea that, we don't want to get involved in another war. It's Europe again, not our issue, not our problem. And so they actively tried to avoid the war for as long as possible. One of the earliest acts that was put into place was the Neutrality Act. And the Neutrality Act of 1939 was one that was created in part to state that the U.S. was not going to go to war, but be able to provide assistance, economic assistance to allies. So, I mean, even in terms of isolation, we don't stay out of it, because ultimately there's financial connections to allies, and as much as they wanted the U.S. to say that they wanted to stay out of the war, they didn't want to fight. They weren't staying out of it entirely, because even from the very beginning, the Neutrality Act set up that we provide economic assistance, but remain out of the war. And of course, this was going to Britain, and it was going to France and China early on. It's going to expand to the Soviet Union with the Lend-Lease program, but with the early Neutrality Act, it was those groups. There was a couple different mottos within this. The first motto that was with the Neutrality Act was aid to allies. So that they're only giving aid to allies whose defense is vital to the United States defense. So the idea being, right, is we're not just giving it because we like them, but those who we see are important for the defense of the United States. This, as the war continued, moved to motto number 2, which was all aid to allies short of war. So they did move to a much more active aid as the war continued, and did provide not only money, but planes, equipment, and things like that. The next thing that the U.S. did was the Lend-Lease program, or the Lend-Lease Act, and this was to authorize military aid. So when it's the Neutrality Act was one stating we didn't want to get into war, but also to give economic aid through a variety of ways. And as it was near the end of that, it began shifting to military aid, and so they created the Lend-Lease Act, which coincided, of course, with the secondary motto of all aid short of war, and this authorized military aid to countries, to allies. However, there was a caveat, which was that they had to promise to return all military equipment after the war, which, here's your blown up tank, which really meant, of course, right, that well, we're going to, lend you these tanks or these planes or whatever military equipment that was useful, that if they couldn't actually return the actual military equipment, then there was an expectation of paying for equipment as well. And this is going to set up the U.S. at the end of the war to be just like with World War I, a lender nation. And what that means is that we come out economically ahead at the end of World War I, and we will come out economically ahead at the end of World War II, in part because we lended and leased all of this equipment and aid to allies that was expected to be repaid in some form or another. And like I said, obviously, they weren't going to be returning broken up or blown up pieces of. Here's the, the 5 pieces we found of this tank or this weapon. This ends up giving billions to Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. Initially, we were allies with the Soviet Union. But of course, with the Soviet Union, after the non-aggression pact that they make with Hitler, we cut that off. Obviously, because and the non-aggression pact. So the non-aggression pact was that the Soviet Union and the Germany would agree not to fight each other. And this shocked, I think I mentioned this before, but this shocked the Western world because they had been enemies before, and no one expected Stalin to do this. We saw them as allies, and this fundamentally, one of the things that's significant with this is it fundamentally changed how we saw the Soviet Union. And this comes back to changed how we saw. This comes back to the Cold War and the tensions between us and the Soviet Union. In part, it's not the only thing. There's other things we'll see at the end of the war that take place with this. But this had a component to the tensions that emerged at the end of World War II, was this sense of betrayal. And it really put a further separation between the Western states and nations and the Soviet Union as not part of that group. And so it does have long-term consequences, not just in the immediate of World War II, but with the Cold War. And that tension. So the whole goal was, we don't want to be involved in war. Okay, we'll help, but we're going to help out economically. Okay, we'll help out all aid except short of going to war. They weren't just sitting around though, and not preparing for the possibility of war. Now Roosevelt definitely had the issue of dealing with it. He also had promoted that he had kept the U.S. out of the war. And you had this walking on this kind of fine line between, we don't want to go to war, but we have to prepare for the fact that we might get drawn into this. They certainly weren't ignoring what happened in World War I and how the U.S. got involved. And so the other thing that they started was the Selective Service Act for drafting young men for the military. Now with this, right, this is easy to then say, okay, well, look, they were already preparing to go to war. It sent 1.4 million men to basic training, and they labeled it as a defensive measure, right? That this was just not that they were planning on invading or attacking or getting involved, but that they needed to be prepared defensively. And like I said, it was very clearly put as not intervention. We're not doing this to get involved. We don't want to be. Of course, all of that changes with Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor is going to lead to a quicker support for the U.S. being involved in the war. Now, how this comes about, as there's a couple of things that were going on with it. The reality is that you had the war in Asia that was taking place simultaneously with that in Europe with Hitler. And the war in Asia, you had the main players, Japan and China, although Japan's goal was to have expansion for their empire, so to expand as an empire. And they saw basically the war with the Germans and Hitler and Italy as being a beneficial move for them to engage in their expansion and conquest that they wanted to do. And they had joined Germany and Italy as allies. So we were aware of this, and yet, as is common in many things, didn't have as much focus on what was going on in the war in Asia, because the argument was it didn't concern us. And we're focused mostly on what was going on in Europe at the time. However, this changed when Japan seized in Indochina. And when they did this, the U.S. responded by freezing Japanese assets and cutting off their oil supply. And now why this is important was that financially, certainly it could impact as far as the financial ability of warfare. But more importantly was the cutting off of the oil supply. And the reason that was the kind of key important moment that is going to move them to act with Pearl Harbor and attack the United States is that Japan didn't produce or does not produce their own oil. So with their oil supply cut off, right, that means no more war. They cannot maintain a long-standing war of expansion if they don't have the oil supply to fuel the ships, the planes, everything that they need to enact war. And so this, they decided then to knock the U.S. out. The goal was to cut the U.S. out of the Pacific theater. Or arena, either way, theater or arena. And hoping that if they could do this all at one blow, then the U.S. would not be able to meddle in their business, and it would give them a free shot to continue and expanding without interference, as well as gain back their oil supply, which was significant. On December 7th of 1941, you had the Japanese carriers launch an attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, what they did is that they brought their pilots close enough so then the pilots could fly in and bomb the Navy, the ships that were docked in Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a significant naval area. And if you could cut the majority, it wasn't the whole fleet, but if you could cut out the most of the ships, like so either disable or destroy the majority of the U.S. fleet in the area, right, then it would take too long for them to be able to formulate, rebuild, bring over a response to stop Japan from doing what they wanted to do. So take too long to respond. Now, this, how it worked was that the naval carrier for Japan came over. They actually had some submarines as well. And then they relied on what were called kamikaze pilots. Kamikaze pilots were suicide bombers, essentially. And it was meant to be a one-way trip. And they were to slam their planes, not their ships, into the ships, the U.S. ships. So first, before they do that, of course, they were to shoot and attack. But then the real devastating damage that took place was from the kamikaze pilots slamming into the ships themselves. Many of the pilots were strapped with extra explosives. And because they took off from where the carrier left them, they also had a good amount of fuel in them to increase the overall damage. And these pilots were trained as kamikaze pilots. It wasn't just something that they just told regular pilots, you're going to do this today. They were trained to dive into the targets after they had attacked in order to cause more damage. This was something that the Japanese did as an expectation. Now, not everyone was a kamikaze soldier or pilot. There were specific positions for that, and this had to do and was connected to the samurai culture. Now, Japan was not a samurai. Didn't have samurai warriors anymore, but its past history had a connection to the samurai culture, and especially within the military, this had not fully gone away. And part of the samurai code had this idea of fighting to the death, and honor, and the idea of suicide as honorable death as well. So one of the things that, now, it doesn't mean that all the kamikaze pilots and soldiers that were told to do this wanted to, but they did train them with the preparation. And so when you have this sense of honor to the empire and emperor, to your family, that was another component as well, and all of this expectation that you're letting your family down if you don't do this. It's your honor and duty as a Japanese soldier to die for your country, fighting to the death. One of the reasons we'll see why the Pacific was so much more brutal than the Western European front of the war was because of this samurai notion of fighting to the death. Rarely did Japanese soldiers surrender. And they were far more brutal to American soldiers who did surrender. The POW camps that took place from Japan were incredibly brutal, and that also stemmed from the idea that to surrender was disgraceful, and therefore that person didn't deserve to be treated with honor or respect. Likewise, then, the mentality is that you don't surrender, you fight to the death. And so the fighting is much more brutal when you know that the other side is not going to surrender. And once they learned how horrible the POW camps were, that if you got caught, that there was a chance that you were going to be put there and or killed brutally as well. And so that plays a huge role in that. But as far as with the kamikaze pilots and stuff, then it's this idea of fighting to the death isn't the honorable thing to do. So, and suicide was an honorable type of death. One of the things that they had in a tradition with samurai soldiers was that if you failed or lost a war or sometimes even disappointed and failed to follow the codes or your leader that you were supposed to do, you were given an honorable out, which was to commit ritual suicide, which of course was done in the most painful way possible. You knelt down and you took your sword and you cut your stomach, disemboweled yourself essentially, and then you had a close friend or person you trusted nearby that after you completed this process, and it was not a quick thing, so it was slow and painful, then your head would be chopped off. And you usually pick someone you trusted so that they would chop your head off. It still was, I guess, a faster death than if you had to slowly bleed out from disemboweling yourself. But this was seen as that suicide, that ritual suicide, as an honorable death. Therefore, to be a kamikaze pilot was an honorable death as well. This ended up having devastating impact on the U.S., on the soldiers, on the fleets in Pearl Harbor. It caught everyone by surprise. There are lots of stories and articles that talk about, if we knew before, that there might have been some warning that was overlooked and ignored. Nonetheless, at the time, the soldiers, the naval yard, the people at Pearl Harbor were caught by surprise. The sailors on the decks of the ships looked up to see the Japanese dive bombers in the sky above them, and loudspeakers came on to warn them that they were coming. So they had a very short window of warning, and in many cases the planes had been spotted by that point. And with this, you had, because of especially the kamikaze soldiers, you had nearly 200 American planes that were destroyed. That had most didn't even get off the airfield. Right, so this wasn't within fighting in the sky. There were some. But most of this was just because everything was unprepared for an attack. It did exactly what the Japanese had planned to do with that. It also badly damaged the fleet, sinking several ships, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. And over 1,200 wounded. So in that sense, the impact of what they were wanting to do in Pearl Harbor was initially seeming to be successful. At the same time, now, Pearl Harbor was not their only goal. At the same time, they had coordinated attacks with Guam and the Philippines and other U.S. bases in the Pacific. The thing is that those were not as successful as Pearl Harbor. And they underestimated not only the U.S.'s ability to be able to mobilize for war, but the coordinated attacks, like I said, did not have as much of a devastating impact as they had hoped, which might have further cut off and crippled the U.S. fleet in the Pacific. This, of course, then is going to lead to a declaration of war. Roosevelt, on December 8th, right, Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. And this, like I mentioned, unlike World War I, you didn't have to convince Americans to go to war, because they were attacked. And being attacked is always going to not only be a justification, but a rallying cry to respond in kind. Initially, the U.S. only declared war on Japan. So there was still some hope that maybe, I don't know how much hope or reality of that we wouldn't get involved in the rest of the war, especially with Japan being allied to Hitler. But we did not declare war on Germany. We declared war on Japan with the small hope that perhaps that we wouldn't get entangled within the European war. But Hitler made this a moot point when he declared war on the United States a few days later. So this then officially puts us into World War II. Like I said, the support for entrance into the war did not require the same level of propaganda what we saw with the propaganda posters in World War I. Instead, we're gonna look at where propaganda takes place with the OWI, which is the Office of War Information, which was the new CPI essentially. Was on war industry, support from home, encouraging women to work. So we're going to look at that when we get to that, of how it was a shifted type of propaganda and an attempt to focus on industry and aid that way, because you didn't have to convince people that war was necessary or a good thing in terms of why the U.S. should be doing it. One of the things that's very different from World War II compared to World War I is that World War II is definitely a war of production. There's going to be a massive increase in goods for the war, which is not only going to lead to jobs, which brings us out of the Great Depression officially, but the idea that whoever can produce the most is going to be the one that wins the war. And that became very clear not only with how much Germany produced versus the Soviet Union versus the United States, but it was no longer a war of attrition like it was in World War I. Now it was a war of rapid industrial production, and who could produce the most and have the most overwhelming force was going to have more success. So this leads us into the type of warfare that took place, and there were two main fronts. Of course, there were a variety of fronts outside of the two largest theaters of war, but the two major ones were the Western and Eastern Front. The Western Front, or European Front, has to do, of course, with Europe. And what's interesting with this is even then we don't get in and land into Europe right off the bat. This takes place with the Grand Alliance that was then created as the United States came into war, which was the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. There was immediately disagreement over where we should go, whether that was into Europe or whether that was in other areas that needed to be addressed. Soviet Union, because they were being attacked, were looking for our aid into taking off some of that pressure. Ultimately, though, that's not where we went. First, in November of 1942, the British and American forces invaded North Africa. Yes, we invaded ourselves. So they invaded North Africa. We did not invade ourselves there. There were German forces in Africa, and this was seen as an important area to stop expansion. And by May of 1943, they had forced the German army to surrender. And as late as the end of 1944, you had more Americans actually deployed to the Pacific than you did to Europe. We'll look at the Pacific in a minute, though. In July of 1943, you have Sicily being invaded, again with the same forces taking place. And after the invasion of Sicily, which starts the liberation of Italy, this Mussolini was the fascist leader there. With the successful invasion of Sicily, you end up having a popular uprising of the people in Rome. And they are going to effectively overthrow the Mussolini government. And so that's going to take him out of the picture. From there, the next move is going to be looking to move into France. The staging area into, we'll say, into Europe was Great Britain. So you had a lot of troops that went over to Great Britain to prepare for a large-scale invasion into France and Germany. And there was a lot of discussion about how this should take place. And part of that was trying to figure out how to get into France, because one of the things that was a problem for getting into France was that Hitler had fortified most of the beaches. And this was putting in barricades, gunnery stations, stationing soldiers, barbed wire, some landmines, because he was aware that France would probably be the entry point in. And so he had ordered the defense of the French beaches to be prepared for an Allied invasion. So you had a problem right off the bat of how you were going to attack. And you actually had an earlier attack by the British that was devastating, where they just got utterly destroyed, because you had, the problem is that beach landings are difficult. Even without the extra fortification, beach landing invasions are hard if there's any type of preparation, because you're coming in at a disadvantage, not only with the ships and then the boats taking sailors and soldiers in, where they can be bombed and attacked, but then it initially almost always guarantees whoever you're fighting to have the high ground, which if they have fortified just makes it even more difficult, which means then you're storming the beaches that you're having to make your way up as essentially sitting ducks to be shot down by machine guns as you try to take the fortified positions in areas, often with various defenses that make it hard for tanks or other larger vehicles and things that could protect you along the way. A lot of the beaches were too narrow for tanks anyway. The ones that were wider that could have a more, not military force, but a larger vehicle-based force were well protected. So one of the things that they did is they actually created a fake army. We'll say who. The U.S. and the British, they created a fake army. And what they did is they actually set up so that the goal was from aerial photos from the planes, right? It would appear that forces were mobilizing. And the goal was to trick the Germans into creating larger fortifications and movement in that direction of the fake army. And the goal then, of course, is if they mobilized and created better fortifications and gave up more people, then what would happen is it would leave openings for the actual beach invasion that they wanted to do. And so this helped some. It wasn't foolproof. But it did provide some aid, as you had some movement to counter that what appeared to be mobilization of forces. But the problem is that the beaches were ultimately too well defended, and there were obvious areas for where you could have deployment of troops. This all eventually led to D-Day, which was June 6th of 1944. And you had nearly 200,000 American and British and Canadian troops that participated. And then more than 1 million troops followed them ashore after the initial wave. It was the largest beach sea-landed operation in history. So this was a massive undertaking, like never seen before, and was also a risk because of what they knew about the German fortifications. But they needed a way into France if they were going to push back at Germany. This was the initial wave, especially of the 200,000 forces. It was very bloody. Lots of people died because of just the dangerous nature of advancing on the beach towards the Germans, who were well fortified and there able to defend. They were successful, and after fierce fighting, the German armies retreated, and then by August you had Paris that was liberated. The D-Day is then seen as the most important for the American push into the war. So, say by August, Paris was liberated. Let's look at some of those images, and then we'll finish talking just about kind of the nature of the Western Front, and then we'll look at the Pacific. So here you have just some examples of the devastation that took place in Pearl Harbor, with this utter destruction of the ships that were docked and ill-prepared to fight the kamikaze style of war. I think this is a good example of just the soldiers that were on there, the utter destruction of these ships. And why so many soldiers died or were wounded with severe burns. So part of the issue was not just the actual fighting, but the fires that ended up exploding on the ships, both from the initial plane attack and then subsequent fires that started from that and spread across the ship. And this led to a lot of burn injuries by the soldiers that were on the ships fighting. And then you have D-Day that we talked about here that just shows the difficulty. I think these show the difficulty of beach landing invasion. So what you don't see here is you had these smaller ships that came out of the larger naval carriers, and they would pull up to they'd still be in the water part of the way, and then soldiers would get out, and you can see, I mean, they're wading in chest deep into the ocean and having to, crawl, walk slowly out. You're not moving fast when you're in this position. And then you have these fortifications and barricades. This is why they had to be dropped where they were. This is what the German army had done, is that they'd set up these barricades so that the ships couldn't make it all the way to the beach, which would have allowed for a faster move and push inward. So even into the water, you had these fortifications by the Germans that created circumstances favorable to them. Here then you can see, once you got on the beach, then you had the problem of trying not to immediately get shot down, because there was no natural defensive areas. You didn't have massive mounds or protective rock structures. You were on the pretty flat beach. They had small areas that were divided in from the bombing and stuff that had taken place. And then you would have to spend your time making very quick runs out in the open. And that's what they did, is if you have the ocean here, and then it's kind of going up the hill within the German fortifications where they had bunkers, right, with the machine guns, is that they would slowly start making their way in parts, but within each of these areas you had to run and be exposed. So it was incredibly dangerous. It's why you had a high death toll. And then once you finally made it to there, you still then had to go in and defeat the bunker and hope that usually it was trying to go in and then throwing in a grenade into the bunker to clear the area, but all the while watching out for other areas where they might be sniping as well. And so this was army crawled in between these fast runs of trying to move up. You army crawled hoping that you weren't injured, and there were, like I said, a lot of injuries and deaths from that initial wave of soldiers. And then here's just another one, which is this one's showing them, this is the smaller boat of them getting off. And then you do have the ships and some tanks that tried to make it onto the beach, but that was relatively ineffective. This then you have made, after D-Day, a much larger wave of soldiers that were able to be deployed into the region. So this is after the successful taking of the beach in France. All right, we'll come back to the Pacific fighting in just a second. So unlike World War I, you don't have trench warfare. This was a lot faster paced war, right? If we remember with World War I, it was slow going for very small gain. And then you had the reverse here, we'll say conditions and style of war, where now you were moving through and taking territory at a much faster pace. Faster paced war, larger territorial gains. You had a combination of, we'll call it street warfare, where they had to clear cities, towns along the way. And so you had the fighting where it would be buildings and homes, and wondering if there were German soldiers in the buildings, and having to make your way through street warfare. This was the more intense fighting and dangerous, because you never knew where soldiers might come out of, where you might be ambushed, what was around the corner. And then of course you also had civilians in the mix as well. And so it was dealing with civilians, knowing if it was a German soldier dressed as a civilian, whether they were up in a building, and you had to clear all of that before you moved on. You also had forest area, more, we'll say, open territory fighting. And open, this could be in the German forest. Also, the forests were probably the biggest area that this took place, but over just more open land. Here they relied on foxholes. So these were not like trenches, but rather you dug a small pit, and the Pacific will use these as well, to protect yourself. And because you weren't clearing an area, but there was an enemy, passed in the forest a ways, and the goal was often to sneak up on them initially, or advance as close as possible before the outright fighting. And so they had foxholes as well, and you'd move from foxhole to foxhole. Here you could stay for a day or two. Right, unlike trenches, right, it was shorter, but they were very, there was not a lot of space for them. You didn't really have anywhere to go to the bathroom. You ate in there, you slept when you could, and then you had to pay, this type of fighting required you to pay really close attention. There were stories of one soldier who stumbled upon a German soldier who was going to the bathroom because there weren't clearly defined lines, and their foxholes weren't that far away, and he had walked off to go use the bathroom, and the U.S. soldier patrolling walked right into him, and so you had to be careful of that, as well as of course just being surprised by the enemy showing up in an area you didn't. This was usually not as intensive fighting as the street warfare, if you will, because this was often larger forces, where the street warfare often sent smaller units in to clear areas. But again, you have a much different type of style of fighting. It goes much faster. You felt like you were accomplishing something that the World War I really had put on the psyche as not being successful. The Pacific Front then was actually where a larger majority of the soldiers were sent, and was significantly more brutal and difficult of fighting. Those who fought on the Pacific Front experienced a very, very different type of war than those that fought in Europe. They were fighting Japan and allies on various islands. So you had a lot of island fighting and trying to conquer. The conditions of the islands are going to play into this. You had a lot more naval battles, as well as they did use the airplanes as well for fighting, for bombing ships, islands, and actual fighting in the air. The conditions of the islands were one of the things that made it so brutal. You had a lot more of what would be considered tropical weather. So you had rainstorms and humidity. That just often made it miserable to be in. Soaked clothing, oppressively hot. There were tons of bugs and mosquitoes that also led to stomach problems. They also did have supply issues because of it being on islands. and not getting enough food. And then, of course, you had the brutality. We're going to put that as a separate one. So there was another island that had a lot of volcanic ash. And stalled there. The volcanic ash, when it got wet, turned into this type of paste. And not only got in everything and everywhere, but made it difficult to move. It clogged up weapons. It ruined food and water. So, like I said, these type of islands that you were on were just, the conditions themselves of the islands were very, very unpleasant. Europe, even in the colder weather of Europe, had to be far more favorable than the weather conditions and climate conditions that they were fighting on the islands. Now, the other part, of course, was the brutal fighting and nature of Japanese fighters. And we talked about this with the samurai soldiers. They weren't samurai anymore. But the fact that you still had that Japanese, that samurai mentality, meant that they would fight to the death. You also tended to have not only with fighting with guns, but the Japanese soldiers while they would start by firing with weapons, would attack with swords. So after they had exhausted their bullets, or when it got into close quarters, they would come charging at you with a samurai sword. And this is just psychologically terrifying, to have a screaming man with a sword coming at you. There was also a fear of being killed by the sword, hacked to pieces, over being shot by a gun. Not necessarily always more or less painful, but it definitely had a psychological component to it. They also, the way that the Pacific was set up is that they, on many of the islands, especially Iwo Jima and Okinawa, there were others too, but these two especially were some of the most brutal fighting, because what they had is they had entrenched themselves in tunnels and fortifications in the mountainside. They also had traps on the beaches. So they had a whole tunnel networking system which could move them around different parts of the mountain. And once again, you have the Japanese soldiers had the high ground. And so you're moving your way up on that. You also had civilians that were used as shields and tricks, often against their will. So they would put them out and have them dressed up, pretending to be walking by as Japanese soldiers, or they would just make them go first, knowing that the Americans didn't want to shoot the civilians. And then you'd have Japanese soldiers that would hide in with the civilians to attack. But the tunnels and traps, what they did is that they had this whole network, and some of them went all the way up to the beachfront. And as the army was moving in, all of a sudden someone nearby to you just disappeared. And what was happening is they had a trap door that would open up, and they'd grab the person. Well, they did either you'd open it up and shoot people, so then people would be dying from gunfire, but you wouldn't know where it would come from. They also grabbed people and pulled them into the tunnel, and then killed them. And so you had these people, you had your soldiers around you disappearing or being fired at from where you couldn't figure out where the gunfire was coming from. And that was terrifying in of itself, let alone the fact that there was more brutality in the killings. There was way more use of flamethrowers to basically root out those that were in fortified positions. More use of hand-to-hand combat, close combat, we'll say. knives, the swords and stuff. And that close combat is not only more psychologically damaging, just because of the brutality, but then of course with using swords and knives and stuff like that, it can be bloody and gory. Not that the other wasn't, but and then you're burning people alive using the flamethrowers, and then you have these Japanese soldiers that are coming at you with samurai swords, and then a quick realization that American soldiers, when they were captured, sometimes were brutally killed. Now, in some of the fighting that was normal, it wasn't and brutal, but some of those people that got pulled into the tunnels were killed in a very, very brutal way. All of this led to a far more fierce and brutal fighting when the fighting took place. So let's look at here. You can see one of the island hopping that took place in the Pacific, with the goal of making it towards Japan, and one, controlling all of the different islands, which provided supply chains, staging grounds. All of those things were important for being able to make a final push to mainland Japan. But they wanted to have control of these islands, not only taking away Japanese control of them, which cut them off from supplies and other things they wanted, but created, as I said, good staging grounds and supply routes for American soldiers. So you have a lot of movement to different islands, and I think this is here where you see it more of a World War I mentality, is it felt less like making progress compared to the European front. Because your main goal is Japan, and yet you're constantly stuck for months and months and months with fierce, brutal fighting for very small amounts of gain, and never really making it to mainland Japan. And then here you see the tunnels. So all tunnels were, once they were discovered, were approached extremely cautiously. Because the thing is that when both in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, when they finally were successful, and it was clear that the U.S. military had won, and they had kind of stopped fighting at that point, they heard throughout the mountain where you'd hear periods of boom, boom, boom. And what was going on is the remaining Japanese soldiers that realized that they had lost were killing themselves by setting off a grenade. Again, that's that samurai culture of the honorable suicide rather than be captured. And so they knew going into these tunnels that there could still be plenty of Japanese soldiers hiding in them, and that they weren't going to surrender, that they were going to be fighting to the death. And they were often dark and, of course, unknown and unfamiliar. So not only did you have to fight and take small gains of a very brutal fighting, but then you had to also then go in this very anxious, high tension situation, somewhat like the street fighting, but even more extreme of the European front, clear the tunnels in these areas. And they also had caves where there were soldiers and stashes. They also had fortified gunnery positions. I know I have a picture in there of that. And here, this is just showing fighting in the Pacific, the conditions of the island. A lot of tropical overgrown forest, easy places to hide. Here's another cave tunnel system. Here, these were all throughout the islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa especially. Where this is what was shooting at you on the beach, and then there were also people with machine guns, and so you had to not only make your way up here, but then get into there. And this wasn't usually the only way in. There was sometimes from the top or the back, but disable and kill those that were manning and defending this. And these were well defended. That even aerial strikes by planes that were bombing usually didn't destroy these. So this was a massive issue that was constantly had to deal with. Here you see another area on the beach, this with a Japanese soldier that had died, but this is that tunnel. Part of it's exposed now, but what they did is you had on the beach the tunnel part, and then you had this area here. Now, some of them, it was just that they were hiding underneath here, and so they could pop up and shoot at people who were just walking by unsuspectingly, where it looked like nothing was taking place. Other ones would be fully covered up, right, with the grass and stuff that way. And then this door here would open up as like a trap door, and they could shoot and then hide. So even if they shot someone, if the other people didn't see where it came from, then you would be looking around you, moving around, searching the ground, trying to figure out where they were popping out from. The other type then was a full tunnel, right? This one's an open one. So this one was either this was probably covered, but it looks like it had been moved away. But it looks like it doesn't move out into a tunnel, but just an open area. So they were using it as a hiding spot to be able to then pull up and shoot. But they had full-on tunnel ones, which led back to the caves and the tunnels in the mountain, where then they would pull, soldiers would be dropped down into the tunnel and grabbed and disappear. So this was also psychologically terrifying. And then here, right, this is by a soldier who was taking these pictures and marked, a careful and cautious investigation was made of all Japanese caves, which were a slow component. And then this is in Okinawa, of not only the beach landing, well, this is after it, but the devastation too that took place. You know, all these trees, all of the landscape where it's being bombed and obliterated. The Japanese actually intentionally destroyed areas so that they had no defensible position. So they literally cut down all the trees, they burned all the grass. So it was this kind of wasteland area. So the U.S. had no defensible area. Right, and so all of that they were having to deal with within the process of invading. So those were the two theaters. Again, very, very different experiences. If you watch the HBO's Band of Brothers, that shows the European front. If you watch the HBO's The Pacific, that miniseries shows the various islands and trying to make your way towards Japan. Both are really, really good series that not only talk to soldiers that fought during those battles, but then each miniseries shows a different battle that took place with the actors, and is pretty good at being accurate with a lot of how it worked. And so you do see the Pacific is much bloodier and gorier and brutal than the European front. I mean, both is war, so they're all ultimately brutal, but definitely by far you see with the Pacific. All right, so what I want to switch to now is looking at the home front and what was life like for those living at home in the United States, because it was different than World War I, mostly in terms of a more extreme version of World War I as far as rationing, promoting the war industry and labor. And then we're also going to look at women in the military, because for the first time, World War II is the first time that women were officially accepted into the military. Women helped in World War I as nurses and the Red Cross, but they were not official military individuals. World War II is actually going to have the Women's Army Corps, or WAC, that they were officially part of the military. So that was a huge significant change and step for women, and there were definitely tensions and issues with that that took place from that. So what we're going to look at first, though, is going to be rationing. As I mentioned before, we'll say in daily life, the propaganda is going to take a different role, because you don't have to have the whole propaganda force convincing people to support this. You are going to have the OWI, which is the Office of War Information. And they are basically the CPI of World War I. They're going to focus on the home front. And there is going to be some propaganda on supporting rationing, not going and doing the black market. They're also going to, so they do propaganda posters and signs and ideas with rationing. They're going to do with the war industry, both for men and women, but they're going to have a very specific focus on women and the labor force. And so that's where we're going to see them push things the most, is in those areas. Rationing became necessary because, again, remember, World War II was about production. And so there was a massive need for supplies. And not just supplies, but of course food for the soldiers. In World War I, it was voluntary rationing. They encouraged home canning and rationing, but it definitely was volunteer rationing. It was not required. In World War II, it was required rationing. And so what this meant is that you had war ration stamps. So for the war ration stamps, you had to apply for each family member. And how it worked is that you got these stamps for various goods, like sugar, bread, things like that, coffee, anything that was deemed an essential supply for the war effort was rationed. And that was a lot of different things, because it wasn't only food stuff, it was oil, it was rubber, it was anything that they needed for production, plus all the food that they were using to feed the soldiers. And you still had to pay for the goods. But you could only buy those goods if you had the stamps for them. And there was an allocation of so many stamps or an allocation of how many goods you could have. So for example, sugar, you got, which sounds like a lot, and the rations amount changed throughout times, but they would say that you could only have 2 pounds per month, right? And meat had certain days. There were also certain days you could buy items. So if you didn't have the stamps, and each stamp was for a certain amount, so you didn't have to buy all 2 pounds, right, of sugar at once, right? A lot of them were ounces, so you could get, so many ounces of this, that with one stamp. If you had 2 stamps, then you could get 2 ounces, right? And they gave so many stamps based on the rationing of what they for each family member. So you had to apply for each family member. Then you had to hold on to these stamps, and then you had to go to the grocery store and know not only what the prices of things were, but make sure that you had enough ration stamps to be able to get those items. And so it became a whole thing. There was a black market for this that did rise up in selling goods without stamps, which then they tried to, the OWI put up posters against. But this did fundamentally change the nature of day-to-day aspects of how you lived your life, as far as having to, you definitely had to plan and prepare before you went to the grocery store. There was a different store here. They definitely made recipe books on ration amounts, what you can make with your rations. Right, and just the awareness of that. They also promoted, again, just like World War One, canning and planting your own garden and food. Right, that saves as a way. So this is what the there was war ration books 1 through 4, and each one had different items in it, right? And so there was a whole separate application card that you filled in and they sent back to you. And then once you were approved, you got these books, and then you had to fill out your name and all this information about you for each family member. Here's what a war ration whole packet would look like. Initially, these don't. I have a couple of these, but they're hard to find because a lot of people got rid of these. The actual cover here of these ration books are often, you can find still. It's harder to find them with the stamps in. But so you got this kind of leather book, and then your ration books would go into here. You had a separate fuel oil ration. And here's one from one as well. And then you had, here's the sugar, the pounds of sugar that they could get. So sugar was its own separate thing just because of how much in high demand it was. And so you had to carry around these packets with you everywhere you went. Here, this is what the stamps looked like. And so each one had a different code and picture and color, and you would rip off, they were perforated, and they're just like stamps. And you'd rip off however many you needed to buy whatever supplies that you were getting. And then here, so they had all the OWI did all of these different posters to get people to be aware of, right? Look for ounce weight on the label, 8 points, right? And that was based on the stamps, 13 cents each. Look at the point value before you buy. Points have nothing to do with prices or quality. Point values will be the different. You also had this, oops, there we go. The point ration chart, and these changed. So one of the things, right, is that this changed all the time. So you had to constantly be aware of the points to make sure that you have enough, because one week you might have enough points to get something, and then if the points change the next week you wouldn't. And then so you have these different, right, look, I mean, this just shows you how many foods in of itself, and this is just some of them. This is not everything. This doesn't include meat at all, which was a separate thing, and sugar was its own separate thing. So you have cans here, and the size, and then the points that it would use: baby food, frozen, dry, dehydrated, and this was a chart. These charts that you, like I said, you constantly had to pay attention to and kind of take with you. And so then here is this other one: to buy canned, bottled, and frozen fruits and vegetables, dried fruits, juices, and all canned soups. It's cut off here, but it's how to shop. This was a guide, right, with War Ration book 2. And they did one of these for all the books. So this was just for War Ration book 2. And that's because it was complicated. And so then it shows you, right, use this ration book. You may use one or all of your family's ration books when you shop. You may not shop with loose ration stamps. You had to bring in the whole book because you had to show this book when you purchased that. And the part of that was the black market and trading stamps and things like that. A, B, and C stamps are good in the first ration period. Use blue stamps only. All blue point stamps marked A, B, and C are good during the first ration period. They add up to 48 points for each member of the family. The numbers show points. You will not be able to get exchange in point stamps, so make sure your low value stamps for buying low point food. Look at the point value before you buy. Points have nothing to do with the price. Point values will be the same in all stores. Give the stamps to your grocer. Tear out the stamps in the presence of your grocer or tear them out in the presence of the delivery boy. Fresh fruit and vegetables are not rationed. Use them instead of ration foods whenever possible. Try recipes that make your rations go further. Your point allowance must last for the full ration period, right? You didn't get extras. And then this one, of course, this is from the OWI. Of course I can. I'm patriotic as can be, and ration points won't worry me, right? And it's that home canned goods. And promoting the idea of, if you're concerned about using up all your rations so that it's not going to be enough, home can your goods, and that or the fresh vegetables and stuff that way, and then that way you don't have to worry and you'll have enough food. There was another one where it was a girl asking her mom, "Mommy, are we going to have enough to eat?" And I'm saying, yeah, we will. You know, I planned ahead, and it shows her with her ration books and things like that. So, I mean, it really was a real concern. It was a dramatic change in how people lived their life. Because again, you had encouraged voluntary rationing in World War I to now a forced required rationing that was complicated system that required a lot of work, and many women talked about it as it was almost a full-time job to manage your ration books and shopping and knowing what the prices were and paying attention to changes. And so it added a lot of time for, and the who was shopping were women, either because their husbands were fighting, or even if they weren't, the women were the ones that went shopping. The women were the ones that were managing these war ration books and were the ones that were having to figure out and navigate this complicated system. And so it was a very time-consuming part of life that made Americans more aware of the war and the impact itself, because it wasn't something that was just overseas. It was impacting them in life. Now, the next area we're going to look at is the war industry, right? And this is also from the OWI. I mean, almost all the posters are from this. Service on the Homefront, Citizen Defense Corps, Citizen Service Corps, American Unity, Salvage Program, Victory Gardens. Victory Gardens were from World War I as well. There's a job for every Pennsylvanian in these civilian defense efforts. And so this one is specific to the state, and then you had national ones as well. We'll come back to look at the rest of these in just a second. So let's look at war industry. We're on B here. Because you had a massive push in production for war, you had a need for workers. But while there were still some men there, a lot of the men were now at war. And because the men were now at war, right, this meant that they looked to women to fill in those holes in the industry. But one of the things that they had to do was convince women to come into these positions. And so there was a whole propaganda push to incorporate women into these, what was either called war industry or defense industry. And in part of that was because these were seen as traditionally male jobs. Women were not the ones that worked in the factories. They weren't ones that, well, one of the problems was that there was a fear of, not feminization, D Feminization. and this is going to be with the military too. The fear that women would become too masculine if they took up these jobs, or wouldn't be able to do them, was definitely another thing as well. So women became the objects of a massive propaganda campaign to urge them to do their bit for Uncle Sam. You had slogans like, the more women at work, the sooner we will win the war. And how they phrased it, was that it was this altruistic position, right? Because the argument was, well, these are male jobs, so how do we reconcile that? So the idea became that one, these were temporary jobs, right? That would women would go back to being wives or in traditional female jobs after the war. The other part of it was that it was altruistic, right? It was patriotic. This was for the greater good. So this was okay for women to do because it was, this temporary and altruistic patriotic thing. Now, the propaganda worked in part from women needing jobs because their husbands are at war, to the propaganda itself. Between 1940 and 1945, you had almost 5 million new female workers enter the workforce. Largely that for the first time, right? It was like a 43% increase total of women workers. And this was new. Of course, lower class women, poor women had always had to work to survive. But you had middle class women. This is who made up most of these new workers, that were married and had children, that were working for the first time. And this is going to be significant for some of the way that women begin to identify with liking work, like in the video with Rosie the Riveter, and the idea of that this was something that was fulfilling, that they actually enjoyed doing, and felt that they were helping out, do their part within the war industry. Where this kind of culminated in terms of propaganda was with Rosie the Riveter. Now, Rosie the Riveter, they don't know exactly where they started. There was a song about with it named as that. And then you end up with Norman Rockwell's painting. And then later the more known We Can Do It painting. Which was not copyrighted, so this became the more popular one. And then this became a whole campaign by the OWI with pictures and news articles about women working in the war industry. And there were some very key characteristics that they emphasized, and this had to do with that fear of defeminization. That there was this anxiety that women working in these jobs were going to become men, especially because what you do have with that is so the issues or fear, we'll say, right? You have that they were wearing pants or overalls, that they were working in male-dominated jobs. Right, that they were working instead of at home with the kids. So Rosie the Riveter targeted these things and looked at, she was these things, yes, strong, patriotic, altruistic, right? Because then those things were temporary. But she was also feminine, and usually showcasing makeup, eating, breaks, things like that. The idea was to showcase this duality between femininity and the more traditional male jobs. And this became kind of the rallying cry, largely with women. One of the biggest areas that they worked was in the airplane industry. And it's where Rosie the Riveter was showcased the most. Boeing was one of the largest employers. So if we look at the images with that, here you have, this one's going to go for whack, right? But you have the OWI again, blueprint for victory, guns, planes, tank, ships, waves, wax, workers. They're all with us to win, right? So this is all of them. It's the idea of whether it's within the military, whether if it's with industry, women are necessary for the success of the war. There were a lot of direct attempts of taking pictures of women not actually working, because that gave a softer side to it. Is yes, they're in overalls or coveralls, they're in traditionally male dress, but you don't see them actually doing the work. And the video talked about how, like, RB showcasing them eating. Here, this one, right, lady of fashion. So women needed to replace men in our essential war industry. So this one is trying to, create that idea of, the fashionable senses, being in the coveralls, taking your work pail to lunch each day. This is the Rosie the Riveter, the Norman Rockwell one. And here you have that combination of both masculine and feminine components to it. And of course, oversized aspects as well. Oversized arms, oversized riveting gun. Here you have Rosie written on it. She's standing on the book Mein Kampf, which is so they help win the war effort. Here, women often wore pins. This one's her ID badge, and this was shown in the video and stuff, but just as a refresher. And you had pins for supporting the Red Cross, donating blood, clubs and things you were on, so it shows that you were patriotic, and that you supported the war effort. And this was only done mostly by women. Men didn't tend to wear the pins. But then she's also eating a sandwich. Right, you have makeup to show that she's feminine. In fact, the OWI suggested that women get a break. They get multiple breaks to freshen up, which meant put on more makeup, because that made them more productive. To feel feminine, that they needed to, to refresh ourselves. Is one of the questions. We need to be neat and trim and well put together. It helps morale. And then the idea that she has makeup on her cheek, but she also has dirt. So it's that dirt and makeup. The fact that the masculine frame and clothing. They mentioned too, right? She's wearing both the goggles and the face guard. You don't need both, but it kind of makes it look like a halo. So you had this duality between masculine and feminine, and trying to showcase that they're capable of doing the male work, but they still retain their femininity. That was key with that. Here you have the more popular one, which is definitely a little more feminine. You don't have the brawn and the dirt and all that stuff. We can do it. And it was meant to encourage women, to push women to say, take part in that. So this one became more popular. But really Norman Rockwell's one kick-started it off. And then you have pictures with women in the war industry of riveting. You had a riveter and a bucker in order to put in all the rivets into various machinery, often with Boeing with the planes. And then, so that's it for that one. Now, there was pushback both for this and for women in the military. Let's see, we'll do it here. So one of the things, and this was the frustrating thing, is you had this push and pull that took place between what women, what the OWI, what society was telling them, what women enjoyed, and then all of a sudden also what society was telling them is, no, you shouldn't be doing this. So you had all of this propaganda to say, we need you. The only way the war is going to be successful is if you join. It's patriotic, you're doing your duty, it's necessary. And then you have come in and say, no, you shouldn't be working if you were a mother. Your job is to be a mother. And so you had the opposite that started to take place, is that the argument that women, well, especially, we'll say, mothers should not work. That their job was to their children, right? And more importantly, that because of working, when they worked, this led to juvenile delinquents. Which was a new word, by the way, that wasn't really around before. That if you work as a mother, then your children are going to become juvenile delinquents. Your whole focus should be on your children. So women then ended up getting pushback, and we'll see it with the women in the Army Corps with WAC too. They get pushback from that as well. Yes, we need you to do this, but no, you're a bad parent, you're a bad person if you do. So I'm going to read just a couple of things from this. There were these articles that got put out. One was, should we draft mothers? And this was by James Madison Wood. And then the other one that we're going to look at is Mothers Our Only Hope. And I couldn't find, these are from Women's Magazine. It's a book that has all of these articles that were published in women's magazines during this period. And this was by J. Edgar Hoover. And I can find these online. If I do, I'll put them online. Otherwise, I'm just going to read you some excerpts from them, because it's very eye-opening to see the issues that women dealt with being told, like, really two opposite directions. You had this massive dichotomy of, yes, you should do this, and this is your duty, and it's important, to, oh, you are a horrible person for doing this, you shouldn't be doing this. So I'm going to look at, should we draft mothers? You hear so many mothers say, I feel guilty because I'm not working in a war plant. These mothers have been led to believe that the rearing of children has become a non-essential activity in this country. Apparently, they do not realize that their primary responsibility is to their children and the America of tomorrow. The job of every American mother in war and peace is to care for her children. There is no more important job than in this country today. The future of our nation depends every bit as much upon the morality and health of our next generation as it does upon winning the battles in Europe and Asia. And so then it goes on to say, we have thousands of underfed, neglected children tied to clotheslines. So there was a rumor, and this may have happened occasionally, but this wasn't some widespread thing where mothers were hanging up their infant children on clotheslines. But supposedly there was a rumor going around that women were doing this to go to work. Most women who were married and had children that were going to work in the factories in the war industry either went at night when their children were asleep, when they had older children, elementary and high school, middle school, high school kids, or had a grandparent that watched the kids while they were gone, or they went in after, as soon as their kids went to school. So most were not tying children up to clothespins. However, there was a fundamental issue with this, and we could put that down with it as far as lack of support, is that you didn't have, there was poor child care options. Other countries had created national child care so that the women could go drop their kids off and go work in the war industry and know their kids were taken care of, as well as some countries actually gave women hot meals to take home after a day's work because they realized what they were doing. But there was a negative image in the U.S. to child care, and more importantly, national child care especially, right, that you were a bad mother, and that you couldn't take care of kids if you had to have child care. And then this idea of national child care as poor or cruel. And then just like I said, a lack of helping with home life so women could work. So instead of setting it up so women could work and that their kids were looked after, the whole mentality of the U.S. kind of created this idea that to leave your kids in childcare was a horrible thing. So you were better off. So for many women, so some women did leave their kids at home, usually not infants tied to clothespin lines, mind you, but left their, old elementary school age kids at home when they went to work, rather than put them in childcare because of that negative image and stereotype that was left with it. Most, though, tried either to work when the kids were in school or sleeping, or if they had infants, having grandparents or friends come over and watch the kids. Nonetheless, here's what it says. We have thousands of underfed, neglected children tied to clotheslines, locked in cellars, or left to run wild while mother wields a blowtorch. We have courtesans, school-age girls, diseased in mind as well as body. We have illegitimate babies. Our juvenile delinquents are learning every form of vice and crime: drunkenness, dope addiction, murder, kidnapping, rape, and robbery. While we are fighting the international gangsters, we are breeding in our own midst countless young gangsters who might have been decent, useful citizens if their mothers had not put activities outside the home ahead of their duty to their children and society. So here, this is blaming women, saying your kids are drug dealers and gangsters and murderers all because you went to work. Your daughters are prostitutes, all because you went to work, which is just absurd. And so imagine being told by society, you need to do this, this is your patriotic duty, and then you do, and they go, you are a horrible person, you have ruined your kids' lives, they are now juvenile delinquents. It goes on to say, if the draft imposes financial hardship on some mothers, why not pay them for staying at home and rearing the America of tomorrow? So this one does offer the option of saying, let's pay women to be mothers, then, if that's the necessity is for financial reasons. But at the same time, it's so blaming of mothers for working, which they had also pushed and used in propaganda. This is the basic responsibility of the American mother. She is the only one who can turn the tide of juvenile delinquency. She is the only one who can guard the home. Her patriotic duty is not on the factory front, it is on the home front. So this makes you feel guilty for working, even though then they had put that whole patriotic aspect out. Now, the next one I'm going to read a few excerpts from is the Mothers Are Only Hope. So the one I just read was Should We Draft Mothers by James Madison Wood. I only read some excerpts from it. And then J. Edgar Hoover, Mothers Are Only Hope. This one gives examples. A certain boy at 15 was an honor student and an eager reader of the best books and magazines, healthy and athletic, and in every way normal. A year later, he is driven first to perversion and then to crime. When we see this same boy at 16 beginning to serve a life sentence for the brutal murder of his little 6-year-old sister, all because of parental incompetence and neglect during a critical period in the boy's development. We know what we are up against, what the whole country is up against. It's not juvenile delinquency, but adult delinquency. So then it's saying you're adult delinquent because you're working, and your child turns from a 15-year-old honor student to a brutal murderer. I mean, that's what's absurd with this, right? And then it goes on. At this point, the war enters the picture by placing a double burden on mothers. Fathers who might be roused by a campaign of education to become not only examples for their children but are in many instances away at war or war work, or are employed at hours which make normal family contacts impossible. If the drift of normal youth towards immorality and crime is to be stopped, mothers must do the stopping. So here then it's saying, right, like your responsibility as a mother is to stop the immorality and crime, and the only way that can do that is through mothers, and the only way you can do that is by not working. They must not only feel responsibility for setting the right example for their daughters, but must keep continually before their sons' eyes the good examples of their absent fathers. There must be no absenteeism among mothers. So then it's suggesting that from working like as a Rosie the Riveter in the war industry, you're an absentee mother. The happy home, the one in which there is no delinquency, no matter what adjective you wish to place in front of it, is the home where the child rushes in. Okay, I'm going to read this paragraph. Listen carefully to this. This is their idea of what women should be doing with their children, which is just absurd. It basically is saying the woman should be a servant to their child and give them whatever they want so they don't become delinquent. So, sorry, here's what it says. The happy home, the one in which there is no delinquency, no matter what adjective you wish to place in front of it, is the home where the child rushes in and calls mother and gets a welcoming answer. If, as so often happens in wartime, the child has done a day's work, mother should be on the job to give that answer. To back it up, there should be a hot meal ready to serve and a mother fully dressed and ready to receive not only her own children, but their friends. They won't be the friends she used to know, whose mother she knew. The mother who does not provide that decent place is definitely falling down on her job. Whatever rearrangement of her own eating, sleeping, and working hours is entailed, she must be ready to give her children and their friends, no matter of how recent vintage the latter may be, hospitality and decency. If she fails to do this, she is driving them to places of their own choosing, clandestine places where they may be hospitality, but where decency is unknown. So this is saying you need to be home all the time, ready to go, fully prim and proper. This will sound familiar when we talk about women, 1950s housewife, suburban housewife. It reminds me of that. So this is pre-suburban housewife, and yet it's so similar. So you should be fully dressed, which doesn't mean like, you shouldn't be walking around naked, but what I mean by fully dressed is looking nice and refreshed, making sure you're dressed nicely, you have your makeup on, your hair is done. That's what they mean by fully dressed. Ready to receive your kid, so the instant your kid comes home, you're there to say hello, and a hot meal should be ready to serve your child as soon as they walk in the door. And you should be happy to have their friends come to the house. The mother who doesn't provide this is failing. It says whatever rearrangement of her own eating, sleeping, and working hours is entailed. So you are supposed to rearrange your working, eating, and sleeping habits to be there to serve your children. Because if you don't, they're going to go find clandestine spots and be juvenile delinquents. In short, the situation is far from hopeless for any mother who really wants to do a good job for her children and will give time and thought to working out a practical program for doing it. And if enough mothers do that time and thought, the situation is far from hopeless for the nation and its youth. So then it shames you by saying any mother who really wanted to do this could do this. All you have to do is put a little bit of effort into it. Apparently all you have to do is super serve your children and do whatever the hell they ask of you because of fear that they will say, well, screw you, mother, you didn't provide that hot meal for me and didn't do exactly what I demanded as soon as I came home. I'm going into an alleyway to commit murder and drug deals. But that's what this is saying. That's what's so crazy about it. So you had this push and pull that was taking place, and we're going to see it with the whack, and you'll see it in the 1950s as well. So it was kind of this double burden of you're supposed to be working, but oh, bad you for working. Okay, we're at a time frame where I don't want to go on and make this a 2-3 hour thing. So we'll stop here. I will pick up in the next lecture. I will talk about women in the military, the Japanese internment camps, and the atomic bombs. That's what we still have to cover, but that's going to push this too far in length. So we'll stop there, and we'll pick up those topics in the next lecture.